Congresswoman, let's be honest. Aren't you just playing the race card to avoid the real issue here? The words hit the studio like a sudden crack of thunder. Chris Wallace's voice carried the sharpness of a blade, slicing through the hum of lights and cameras. The seasoned journalist leaned slightly forward in his chair, his gaze fixed firmly on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who sat poised and unshaken beneath the gleam of the Wallace one-on-one. Studio lights. The audience drew a collective breath. Camera operators exchanged uneasy glances. Even the show's normally unflappable floor director froze, hands hovering over the control panel. For the past 30 minutes, Wallace had been pressing Crockett about her divisive Corporate Tax Transparency and Fairness Act, a bill that had stirred corporate America to its core. He had thrown data, opinion polls, and economic forecasts her way each time. Crockett met his challenge with meticulous evidence, statistics, and unwavering calm. But now, nearing the end of the segment, Wallace abandoned his usual composed, methodical demeanor. The question he'd just hurled wasn't about policy. It was a provocation, a last-ditch attempt to elicit a viral, emotional reaction. Moments like this were television gold. They often sent interviews spiraling into chaos, anger, defensiveness, awkward silence, all perfect fodder for news cycles. The studio air grew heavy with expectation. Crockett didn't move for a few seconds. Her eyes met Wallace's, cool and unreadable. Then she reached for her water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down with quiet precision. "Chris," she began, deliberately using his first name, her voice level, clear, and almost disarmingly calm. "I've referenced 17 independent economic studies today. I've cited the Congressional Budget Office's official report on my proposal. I even quoted your own remarks from 2016, where you said corporate loopholes undermine public trust. Not once, in any of that, have I mentioned race. You just did. And I think your viewers deserve to ask why." The silence that followed was absolute. Wallace blinked once, twice, as though recalibrating. The control room went dead quiet. In 50 years of broadcasting, he'd faced presidents, generals, and dictators. But in that moment, the legendary interviewer found himself with nothing to say. That exchange would later be replayed on every major network and dissected in journalism schools as in composure, a textbook example of how to neutralize a loaded question without a hint of anger or retreat. Earlier that morning, tension had already been building behind the scenes. The sleek Manhattan studio buzzed with energy as producers made last-minute adjustments. Spotlights flared against the modern black and silver set. Assistants scurried to polish the coffee table between the two chairs while the show's executive producer checked his watch for the 4th time in a minute. This wasn't an ordinary broadcast. It had been weeks in preparation, and everyone knew it could spark headlines across the nation at 7. Chris Wallace was a symbol of American journalism's old guard, son of the legendary Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes, and a man whose name had become synonymous with precision and persistence. Over 5 decades, he had interviewed 8 presidents, countless senators, and world leaders across continents. His reputation for fairness and focus was carved in stone. No theatrics, no pandering, just relentless pursuit of clarity. Sitting across from him was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th District. At 42, she embodied a new kind of leadership, young, fearless, policy-driven, and impossible to box in. Before stepping into politics, she had been a respected economist specializing in corporate taxation, with a PhD from Northwestern and a law degree from Stanford. Her years in the U.S. Treasury and academia gave her a rare blend of theory and real-world insight. Crockett had entered politics almost by accident. Her viral Senate Finance Committee testimony, where she broke down complex tax loopholes so clearly that even lay viewers understood had made her a household name. When her district's long-serving representative retired, she ran a grassroots campaign built on transparency and economic fairness. She won decisively. In Congress, Crockett gained a reputation not as a firebrand, but as a strategist, a lawmaker who read every page, cross-referenced every figure, and left pundits scrambling to match her preparation. Her Corporate Tax Transparency and Fairness Act was a reflection of that precision, a bipartisan attempt to close global profit shifting, loopholes without raising tax rates. The Congressional Budget Office estimated it could reclaim nearly $380 billion in lost revenue over a decade, simply by requiring corporations to report profits. Honestly, the same number to investors and to the IRS, predictably. Corporate trade groups called it a threat to competitiveness, launching multi-million-dollar ad campaigns against it. The stakes were enormous. When Wallace's team booked Crockett, insiders buzzed. He was known to challenge everyone, Republican or Democrat, but he also leaned toward fiscal conservatism. Many assumed he'd try to corner her using industry data and economic hypotheticals, and he did. From the very first question, for viewers who aren't economists, what exactly does your bill do? Crockett handled the conversation with a teacher's clarity. It closes 3 loopholes that let corporations tell 2 stories. She explained smoothly, one to their shareholders about how profitable they are, and another to the IRS about how poor they are. My bill simply requires truth and consistency. No tricks. No offshore fiction. Wallace nodded, lips pressed thin, before moving in for his next challenge. Your critics argue this would hurt American competitiveness. The Chamber of Commerce says it could cost up to 300,000 jobs. How do you respond to that? Crockett didn't hesitate. Those numbers, she said evenly, come from a funded report that assumes my bill raises tax rates. It doesn't. It just stops people from cheating the system. If anything, it levels the playing field for smaller US companies that do pay their share. She reached for a slim folder beside her and flipped it open with quiet confidence. Here's a list of the 50 largest American corporations, the 30 highlighted in yellow. They've paid lower effective tax rates than their overseas competitors for the past 5 years. That's not competitiveness, that's creative accounting. Wallace blinked, caught off guard by the sheer depth of her data. He recovered quickly, but not before the cameras caught the faintest flicker of surprise in his expression. The audience noticed, and from that point forward, the balance in the room shifted. By the time he asked his final, desperate question, the one that invoked race instead of reason, the viewers had already seen where the credibility lay. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to lecture. Her calm, fact-based response did what few ever managed in that studio. It stopped Chris Wallace cold. Within hours, clips of the moment flooded social media. Hashtags trended. Commentators called it a lesson in restraint and a blueprint for truth under pressure. And somewhere in a Manhattan newsroom, producers realized they had just witnessed something rare, the moment when preparation, intellect, and grace dismantled a decades-old style of power television. But requiring American companies to pay more taxes than they do now, doesn't that hurt them on the world stage? Actually, studies from both the International Monetary Fund and the Congressional Research Service show no link between lower corporate tax rates and stronger competitiveness. Crockett countered smoothly. What truly drives competitiveness is modern infrastructure, quality education, and regulatory stability, all funded by tax revenue. For the next 15 minutes, the exchange followed this steady rhythm. Wallace presented standard critiques of corporate tax reform, and Crockett countered each point with specific data, academic research, and concrete examples. Rather than relying on vague statements, She named actual companies, cited tax provisions, and referenced detailed studies. When Wallace argued that her bill might hurt retirement accounts invested in corporate stocks, Crockett pointed out that the Congressional Budget Office had already analyzed potential market impacts and found them minimal. When he warned that it could reduce corporate investment, she referenced 2017 data showing that tax cuts had mostly funded stock buybacks, not job creation or capital expansion. As the discussion reached the halfway point, Wallace's tone began to shift. His trademark technique, exposing inconsistencies in a guest's statements, wasn't working. Crockett's responses were tight, internally consistent, and reinforced by verifiable evidence. Congresswoman Wallace said, "Changing strategy, you've criticized corporations for not paying their fair share. But that phrase, fair share, is subjective. What does it really mean to you?" It was a classic pivot, moving from data to philosophy when facts weren't landing. "That's a great question, Chris," Crockett replied evenly. "I define fair share as the amount a company is already required to pay under existing law. My bill doesn't add new taxes. It closes gaps that let corporations avoid paying what's already due. When a small business owner in Dallas ends up with a higher effective tax rate than a multinational firm reporting billions in profits, that's not only unfair, it's economically inefficient. It distorts competition and discourages innovation." Wallace pressed again. "Your bill targets what you call artificial profit shifting, but companies argue there is simply following the law. Isn't this really about changing the rules because you don't like the results?" Crockett didn't miss a beat. "The law already bans profit shifting that lacks real economic. The issue is enforcement. If a company claims $10 billion in profit from an office in Bermuda staffed by 3 people, that clearly lacks economic substance. My bill just requires transparency, making those kinds of arrangements visible and accountable." By the 20-minute mark, Wallace's body language revealed growing frustration. His questions came faster, shorter, sharper. Crockett, however, stayed composed, factual, patient, and the audience, which had started the show divided, was now leaning noticeably toward her side, nodding as she backed every answer with evidence instead of rhetoric. At that point, Chris Wallace decided to change tactics. "You've described this bill as a way to help working Americans," he began. "But isn't it really just pushing a progressive agenda that's unfriendly to business?" "The bill has 6 Republican co-sponsors," Chris Crockett replied smoothly. "Senator Hawley has even introduced a companion version in the Senate. This isn't about ideology. It's about fairness and economic efficiency. Even Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, said taxes should be certain, convenient, and proportional to one's ability to pay. The current system fails on all 3 counts." Wallace glanced down at his notes, hesitating for a moment. Then he made a move that will define the rest of the interview. Abandoning the policy debate, he shifted into more personal territory. "Congresswoman, you've often emphasized your background as an economist," he said carefully. "But some critics claim you rely more on your identity than your expertise to shield your ideas from scrutiny. How do you respond to that?" The question landed with an uncomfortable weight. It was clearly intended to trigger an emotional or defensive reaction. The audience simmered uneasily at the sudden change in tone. Crockett paused briefly, then looked at Wallace calmly. "I'm not sure I understand the question, Chris," she said. "Which critics specifically have said that? And what parts of my identity are you referring to?" It was a brilliant reply. She didn't take the bait, didn't sound defensive, and forced Wallace to clarify his own premise. Realizing he'd been too vague, Wallace tried to reframe. "There's a perception," he continued, "that when you and others in your party are challenged on the details of your proposals, you sometimes imply that criticism is based on bias rather than genuine disagreement. That's interesting, Crockett responded evenly. In this conversation, I've cited the Congressional Budget Office, the International Monetary Fund, the Congressional Research Service, and even data from SEC filings. I haven't mentioned anything about I'm happy to keep discussing the details of the bill. That's what I came here to do. Her response laid bare the disconnect between Wallace's question and the actual content of their discussion, leaving him momentarily off balance. As the interview moved into its final segment, Wallace went for own last shot. Congresswoman, he said pointedly, let's be honest. Aren't used playing the race card to avoid answering the real questions? The words hung in the air. The studio fell completely silent. Every eye fixed on Crockett, waiting for her reaction to the provocative charge. Congresswoman Crockett took a slow, measured sip of water, then set her glass down carefully. Her expression remained composed and focused. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, but mistakenly firm. Chris, she began addressing him by his first name. I visited 17 economic studies during this interview. I've referred to the Congressional Budget Office's official report on my bill. I've even quoted your previous statements about similar legislation. Not once have I mentioned DEDRA. You just did. And I think your viewers deserve to understand why. The studio remained dead silent. As she continued, when we discuss tax policy, we should judge it on facts. Its merits, its economic impact, its administrative feasibility. That's exactly what I've done today. I've brought data, research, and verifiable examples. Her gaze stayed fixed on Wallace, steady and respectful. But when the facts are strong, some people try to change these. They suggest that someone like me couldn't possibly understand economics, despite my PhD and years AF Treasury Department. They imply that my arguments come from identity, politics instead of sound reasoning. She gestured toward the documents neatly stacked beside her. The numbers don't lie. Chris, the CBO report doesn't have a race or gender. The economic studies I've cited come from institutions across the political spectrum. Either my arguments hold up on their merits, or they don't. Then came the moment that would go viral across every major platform within hours. I didn't bring my identity to this interview. Chris, I brought facts. And if someone finds it easier to debate who I am instead of what I'm saying, I trust your viewers are smart enough to see what's really happening. The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, a rare occurrence on Wallace 1-on-1, which was usually known for its restrained tone. The seasoned journalist, famous for his unflappable composure, appeared as the clapping slowly subsided. Wallace tried to regain control. Congresswoman, I know you weren't. Chris Crockett interjected gracefully. You're one of the most respected journalists in the country because you focus on substance. That's why your question caught me off guard. It seemed out of character for someone known for serious fact-based discussion. Her response managed to both challenge the question and offer Wallace a dignified way out, suggesting that his comment was an anomaly rather than his usual professional standard. Wallace paused, nodded slightly, and said, quietly, "Fair point, Congresswoman. Let's get back to the bill." "I'd appreciate that," Crockett replied with a faint, polite smile. Wallace glanced again at his notes, then looked up. "Your bill requires corporations to reconcile their financial statements for shareholders with what they report to the IRS. Critics say that creates unnecessary red tape that could hurt American businesses. How do you respond?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "Actually, most companies already perform these reconciliations internally," she explained, transitioning seamlessly back to substance. "My bill only asks them to submit existing documentation. It doesn't require creating anything new. According to Treasury estimates, the additional cost of compliance is less than 0.01% of the affected companies." She continued confidently. "In fact, several CFOs I've spoken with privately have said they support this provision because it levels the playing field. Right now, companies that follow Beth, the letter, and the spirit of the law are at a disadvantage compared to those that use loopholes to dodge taxes. This bill simply makes sure everyone plays by the same rules. For the remaining minutes of the interview, Wallace returned to his usual style, focused, analytical, and policy-driven. Congresswoman Crockett maintained her composure, answering each question with precise data and well-supported facts. The earlier tension that had filled the studio had dissolved, replaced by a calm, thoughtful exchange that drew the audience back into the heart of the policy debate. As the segment neared its end, Wallace leaned forward and asked a final question, his tone noticeably different. "If your bill passes," he said, "what measurable result should Americans expect to see to know it's truly working?" It was a fair and genuine question, one that treated Crockett's proposal as a serious piece of legislation rather than a political talking point. "3 measurable outcomes," Crockett replied confidently. First, the gap between the effective tax rates of large corporations and small or medium-sized businesses should narrow substantially. Second, multinational companies should show at least a 40% drop in profit, shifting to tax havens as proven by country financial reporting. And third, annual corporate tax revenue shall rise by around $38 billion, all without increasing the statutory rate. She paused briefly before adding, most importantly, these improvements will happen without any harm to legitimate business activity, investment, or job creation as reflected in major economist indicators. As Wallace turned toward the camera for his closing remarks, headed something rarely seen on his show. "Before we wrap up," he said, "I want to acknowledge something." Congresswoman Crockett came prepared with facts, research, and real data. Whether you agree with her bill or not, this has been a genuine policy discussion, something our viewers deserve to see. He looked back at her and added, "Thank you for bringing such clarity and detail to this conversation." It was an unexpected moment of respect from a journalist now, for maintaining strict neutrality. Crockett smiled and replied warmly, "Thank you, Chris. That's what Americans want. Real conversations about how policy affects their daily lives, not political theater." As the affair sign lit up, the studio erupted in a standing ovation. Not just for Crockett, but for the rare sight of a political interview centered on substance rather than spectacle. Crew members exchanged astonished glances. One staffer whispered, "Did Wallace just admit he was wrong? I've worked here 5 years and never seen that." Later in the green room, Wallace approached Crockett privately. His tone was sincere. "Congresswoman, I've interviewed hundreds of politicians. Very few come as prepared as you did today, and even fewer stay composed when That was truly impressive." Crockett smiled appreciatively. "I respect that, Chris, and I respect your work. That's why I was surprised by that one question. It didn't sound like chaos." Wallace nodded, almost reflective. "You're right. When things don't go as planned, sometimes even seasoned interviewers fall into bad habits. Today reminded me that even after 50 years into this business, I can still learn something." By the time Crockett's flight landed back in Washington that evening, the interview had become a nationwide sensation. Video clips of her calm, fact-based exchange were spreading rapidly across social media platforms, amassing millions of views. Viewers from across the political spectrum praised her command of complex issues and her steady demeanor. Even conservative comments joined in. "This is how real policy debate should look," wrote Owen, well-known conservative economist on X, formerly Twitter. "Clear data, solid arguments, and no slogans. Whether you agree or disagree," she showed how serious discussions should be handled. Major news outlets spent the next day dissecting the interview. On Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough commented that it wasn't just a politician handling a tough man. It was a masterclass in how to bring real substance back into politics, even on Fox News. A panelist on The Five admitted, whatever your stance, Crockett showed up with receipts. Facts, figures, and verifiable sources. That's something every voter should demand. The ripple effects went far beyond media praise. Within days, 3 more Republican representatives joined as co-sponsors of Crockett's bill, raising the total to 9, a remarkable show of bipartisan support for tax reform. Senator Hawley, who had introduced the Senate version, publicly applauded her. That's how you defend smart policy with facts, not sound bites. Hesed, she proved corporate tax fairness isn't a partisan issue. It's an American one. Even the business lobby began to. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which had previously opposed the legislation, announced it was reassessing key provisions, acknowledging that some parts may have real merit. A senior industry lobbyist told Politico privately, after that interview, "We can't keep using empty talking points." She exposed exactly where the loopholes are. Either we engage with the facts, or we lose the debate. For Wallace's themament became a turning point. On a later journalism podcast, he reflected openly. "I've built my career on tough, substantive interviews," he said. "But in that moment, I fell into the trap so many of us do, chasing conflict instead of clarity. When her answers stayed grounded in substance, I should have done the same." The Crockett-Wallace interview would be remembered not for the confrontation, but for how it ended. 2 professionals reminding a divided nation that facts, respect, and reason still have a place in American public life. Wallace leaned back slightly and added, "What truly impressed me was how Congresswoman Crockett addressed my question directly without making it personal or partisan. She turned a potentially hostile moment into an opportunity for real dialogue. That's a lesson every journalist can learn from." Media analysts soon echoed that sentiment. The discussion quickly moved beyond the interview itself to a wider reflection on how American journalism covers economic policy. The Columbia Journalism Review released a detailed feature titled The Crockett Standard, Bringing Substance Back to Economic Coverage. The article examined how rare it had become for complex policy conversations to make it onto national television without being reduced to shallow political drama. What stood out, the piece noted, wasn't just Crockett's grace under pressure, but the 20 minutes of genuine policy discussion that came before the viral exchange where a member of Congress showcased deep expertise, while a veteran journalist pressed hair on details instead of political positioning. For Congresswoman Crockett, the effects of that morning interview went far beyond a single news cycle. What began as a typical Sunday show appearance evolved into a defining chapter in her career, one that solidified her reputation as a serious economic thinker and an effective communicator of complex ideas. When her corporate tax transparency bill reached the House floor 3 weeks later, the tone of the debate reflected this shift. Instead of the usual partisan rhetoric, lawmakers from both sides engaged with the substance, analyzing the bill's real economic implications. The final vote, it passed with the support of 47 Republicans, a rare bipartisan victory for tax reform. In the Senate, where the companion bill had been stuck in committee, the renewed attention helped push it forward. Eventually passed with 62 votes, including 12 Republicans crossing party lines, when President Biden signed the Corporate Tax Transparency and Fairness Act into law during a White House ceremony. Both Crockett and Senator Hawley stood beside him, a striking visual of how evidence-based policymaking could transcend party boundaries. This law shows that when we focus on facts and fairness, we can still solve real problems together, President Biden said during the signing. Congresswoman Crockett proved that complicated economic policy can be communicated clearly, defended with substance, and passed with bipartisan support. The law's implementation set a new benchmark for corporate transparency. For the first time, Companies were required to reconcile what they told shareholders with what they reported to tax authorities. The process uncovered significant discrepancies, prompting several major corporations to voluntarily revise their tax strategies to avoid public backlash. By the end of its first year, the legislation had generated $42 billion in additional tax revenue, slightly above Crockett's original projections, without harming business investment, job growth, or competitiveness. Studies from both conservative and progressive think tanks confirmed Thatt's law curbed artificial tax avoidance rather than discouraging legitimate enterprise beyond the numbers. The Wallace interview transformed Crockett into a respected national figure, recognized for substance rather than sound bites. Invitations poured in from across the ideological spectrum. She spoke at the American Enterprise Institute and the Economic Policy Institute, two organizations rarely featuring the same guests, underscoring her unique credibility. Journalism schools soon began teaching the interview as a case study, demonstrating how to remain composed under pressure and how to explain intricate policies and ways ordinary viewers could grasp. Crockett's calm, fact-driven communication style became an academic model for how leaders should handle challenging interviews. 6 months later came an unexpected development. Chris Wallace invited her back. This time, the focus was her new infrastructure financing proposal. For a journalist known for seldom featuring the same guest twice, the invitation signaled deep professional respect. At the start of their second conversation, Wallace did something unprecedented. "Before we get into your new proposal, Congresswoman," he began, "I want to say something. Our last interview made me think deeply about how we, in the media, approach complex policy discussions. You raised the bar for both politicians explaining policy and journalists covering it. I appreciate that." Crockett responded with the same composure and humility that had earned her national admiration. "That's the highest compliment, Chris," she said. "Because at the end of the day, it's not about husking or answering questions. What matters is whether the American people receive clear, accurate information about policies that affect their lives. That's what we all owe them." Political experts later described her first interview as a textbook example of how to diffuse provocation without becoming defensive. One leading textbook summarized it this way: by refusing to accept the premise of a loaded question and keeping the conversation anchored in evidence, Crockett shifted the entire tone of the exchange. Her approach was assertive, but never hostile, principled yet measured. A year later, with the new tax laws, success evident in stronger veins and fairer business competition, Forbes featured her on its cover under the headline, "The Crockett Approach: How Substance Triumphed Over Soundbites." The article detailed how her data-driven, transparent communication style had reshaped not only tax reform, but also the national standard for political discourse in an age dominated outrage and simplification. The piece concluded, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett reminded America that voters can still engage with complexity when it's explained clearly and defended with integrity. Her exchange with Chris Wallace didn't just change one policy, debated revived faith in the idea that democracy still works when we lead with facts instead of fear. Viewers across the country echoed that sentiment. On a popular online comment captured the mood perfectly. "I don't even know if I agree with her, Bill, but I know I just watched someone who actually understands what she's talking about and can explain it clearly. We need more of that from both parties." That simple remark reflected the deeper legacy of that remarkable morning. The belief that clarity, composure, and genuine expertise could still rise above division. The moment when Congresswoman Crockett met a provocative question with calm substance and left an entire of de-owned, thoughtful silence became not just a viral clip, but a reminder of what American democracy looks like when ideas speak louder than anger. If this story of truth over theatrics inspired you, don't forget to hit subscribe and tap notification bell to stay updated. we bring you the most revealing political moments, where real leaders focus on facts instead of conflict. Share this video to remind others that substance still matters, and that the fight for better political discourse is far from over.